I just want to begin with a simple definition. Capitalism is the name for a society, it's a generic term for a society based on exploitation of wage labour. Imperialism is the name for capitalism in its contemporary stage of development. There is nothing, imperialism and capitalism are practically synonymous. It's not a foreign policy, it's not an optional. Capitalism is in its very essence imperialist in today's world. And this imperialist system, this capitalist system, is now facing its deepest ever crisis in its entire history of existence. It's a crisis which is threatening the future of human civilization on this planet. And this crisis is happening now. There are three dimensions of this crisis that we can see straight away. First of all, we can see the political crisis of imperialism, revealed in a dramatic way by the despicable attack on Ukraine by the Russian government. This, amongst other things, reveals the weakness of US and NATO. We will see it reveals the weakness. Since the collapse of the Soviet Union, when the United States and the Western imperialism, they were under the illusion that they had won the Cold War. And they have lost every single war they have waged since 1990. And they are clearly, their ability to control and dominate the world is weakening. And I think that's part of the calculation that Putin made. Second dimension, we can look at the economic crisis of global capitalism. We are in the early stages of the deepest debt crisis that the world has ever seen. I like the analogy of a supernova. You know, like our sun that keeps us warm and etc. It's about only a third of the size that it would need to be for it to end its life in a supernova explosion. Larger stars will inevitably die in a cataclysmic explosion, a supernova. The crisis that capitalism went into, the systemic crisis that led to World War I and that led to World War II, the critical mass had yet to accumulate to the point where you would have a supernova type explosion, but the gigantic accumulation of debt on a scale that is just absolutely stupendous means that there is the possibility that the coming crisis would actually result in what Bill Gross, the biggest, who founded the biggest bond trading company in the world, when he said a few years back that $10 trillion of debt being sold at negative interest rates, this is a supernova waiting to explode. Now we have the interest rates starting to go back upwards. After falling for 30 solid years, interest rates are now starting to climb. The inflationary dragon, which they thought they had killed with the neoliberal reforms beginning in 1980, is now rearing its head once again. This increase in inflation is threatening and the rise in interest rates is threatening to bring down these debt mountains. And when they collapse, they have the potential to develop a momentum of their own. So we're in the early stages of this. So the scale of the economic crisis that we are facing is very difficult to grasp, the magnitude of it. It is much deeper, much more extensive than any crisis that capitalism has ever experienced, including those that led to World War I and World War II. And finally, we see the ecological crisis. The results of COP26 were completely, as to be expected, disastrous. We already have the absolute inevitability of catastrophe. That is already, we're too late to avoid catastrophe. Catastrophes have already started. There is nothing that we can do to stop the melting of the glaciers. We can slow them down. There is nothing we can do to stop sea levels rising. Even if we had zero carbon now, sea levels will continue to rise for at least the next half century. There is nothing we can do to actually stop the mass extinction that's taking place. We've got to slow it down. It will take centuries of socialism and communism to repair the damage that capitalism is doing. And we really are faced with an existential crisis. Human beings have evolved over the past 100,000 years. It is our generation and the next generation which will decide whether all of that was going to result in a future for human civilization or a catastrophic Armageddon ending. Sorry if I'm sounding catastrophist, but all the facts and the evidence pointing to this. And one of the biggest problems we have is denial. It's very difficult to take into account all of the evidence and to draw conclusions from it. So that's my sort of general introduction. I wrote a book, Imperialism in the 21st Century, which I suppose is the reason why I'm being invited here. And one of the things I explained in that book was that the last time that capitalism was in systemic crisis, in the 1970s, it managed to escape from this crisis by shifting production on a massive scale to low-wage countries. The only way they could restore their rate of profit and overcome the crisis of overproduction was by massive cuts in the costs of production. But they couldn't come to workers in Dublin and London and Berlin and United States and say, I'm sorry, we're going to have to cut your wages by 50% because there'd have been a social explosion. But they were able to achieve cuts in their costs of production of a similar proportions to this by a massive, colossal shift of production to low-wage countries. So we saw the proportion of exports of third world countries, which was completely dominated by raw materials and foodstuffs in 1980. Something like 70–80% of their total exports was raw materials. Manufacturing took place in the imperialist countries. In the space of just 15 years, the proportion of the exports of so-called developing countries made up of manufactured goods rose from 10% to over 60% in the space of 15 years. The most colossal shift. In 1980, according to International Labour Organization figures, there was about as many industrial workers in the industrial countries, industrial world, the imperialist countries, as in the whole of the rest of the world. Now, at the very least, something like 83% depends on exactly how you calculate it. More than 4/5 of the industrial working class live in low-wage countries. Less than a fifth in the imperialist countries. That is a colossal shift in the space of a single generation. And that bought capitalism another 25 years to wreak its destruction. And it's come to an end. It's reached the end of the road now. So let's start off. I wanted to try and develop with a big picture, and there we have a big picture. All the people sitting over here have got good eyesight. But anyway, I've got what I think is the interesting slideshow here. I will make it available and you can pass it around. But you see there an amazing picture, which is a composite satellite photographs. I don't know how many thousands of satellite photographs of the world at night put together to give you a picture of the world at night. That's what the world looks like at night. I think it's a very beautiful picture. I think it's stunningly beautiful. However, there are two reasons why it is also an ugly and a terrifying picture. First of all, we can divide the total global population roughly into 5 chunks. The population of India, about 1,300 million people, 1,300 million. Population of China, slightly more, soon to be overtaken by India. The population of Africa, about 1.2, 1.3 billion. Population of Latin America, again around 1 billion, maybe a few more. And the population of the United States and Europe and Japan, the imperialist countries, again about well, 18% of the world population, we're talking about 1.2 billion people. So those 5 chunks, India, Africa, Latin America, China, and the imperialist countries, more or less 20%, right? The countries populated by the 18% of the world population who live in imperialist countries emit more light than the whole of the rest of the world put together. So the first thing you can see when you look at that picture is how extreme the inequalities are between the rich countries and the rest of the world. And look at how dark Africa is. There's as many people who live in Africa as live in North America and Europe and Japan. An unlit continent. Many people don't have access to electricity at all. So that's the first thing you can see, is just how extreme the inequalities are. An intelligent life form from another planet, another part of the galaxy, and I very much hope there are some, and I very much hope they will come to our help. But the first thing that they would see when they notice life on Earth would be noticing how extreme the inequalities are. And I'm sure if they were able to get this close, they would also have a telescope that would enable them to zoom in, and they would see the same inequalities we see here on a global scale. They would see them within each country. And they would see, if they looked at London, they would find that 90% of the population are squeezed into 10% of the land. And they would see that large tracts of London are unlit because they're just huge houses, many of them owned by Russian oligarchs, but by billionaires from all over the planet. When people say this country's too crowded, I'd say it's because the rich people take up too much room. So that's one reason why it's a very ugly picture, because it shows just how grotesque the inequality is on this planet. It is disgusting how extreme the inequality is. Another reason why it's ugly and also terrifying is that is a picture of humanity committing suicide, because that light is being created by burning fossil fuels. We are seeing here human civilization self-immolating. That's what that photograph is actually. It's like a gigantic funeral pyre. That's what that picture is. So let's have a look at, if we zoom in, there's a zooming in, that's a picture from California last year. And so now I'm going to try and quickly go through the rest of this slideshow. I think we've all got a lot to learn from this wonderful fighter. She's got a lot to learn from the socialist and communist movement, but we sure have a lot to learn from her. And I would hope that we can win her to understanding that capitalism is the source of the problem. And I know our next speaker is not actually here yet, but it seems to me maybe I think nuclear power could play an important role in the future energy mix, but the sort of power that we really have to struggle for is political power. And if we don't actually have the struggle for power to establish the rule of working people and to depose the dictatorship of capital, there can be no solution, there can be no future for humanity. It's very much an open question. You have to be optimistic to believe that it's even possible to overthrow the power, because so here's just a few things. The world's richest 1% cause twice as much carbon dioxide emissions than the poorest 50% of humanity. Incredible. Absolutely staggering. 1% if the total world population is 8,000 million, then that means the richest 1% works out at 800 million. That's 1% of 8,000 million. I'm pretty sure. It goes 8,000. 8 trillion. Yeah, so 8 billion, 800,000. Yeah, anyway, so the richest 1% is cause double the carbon dioxide emissions. So it's something for us to remember. And here we see another very interesting, this is from there's a lot of fantastic academic work being done by radical social scientists. Jason Hickel is one, I recommend his work very much, and he clearly explains here that the issue of global climate crisis, or what I prefer to call capitalist destruction of nature, is bound up with colonialism and imperialism. You have to see this as an anti-imperialist struggle. The defence of the environment is a struggle against imperialism, and as I said, struggle against imperialism is the same thing as saying the struggle against capitalism. And the ecological movement has yet to fully understand this. Here we see the same thing now. The sort of colour coding, that little black figure in the left-hand column, that is represents the 1%, and there you can see how the richest 1% are responsible for, I think it's 15% of total emissions globally, whereas the poorest 50%, which is the green, the little bit of green at the bottom, are responsible for just 7%. So when people talk about overpopulation being the problem, they are telling a lie. It's not overpopulation. The poor 50%, they're not causing this problem. They're only producing 7% of the carbon dioxide. What we have is an overpopulation of rich people, an overpopulation of capitalists. So there are three ways to measure carbon footprint. Two you've probably heard of, but just to remind you, one, and this is the one that's used all the time in the COP26 and everything else, and that is you work out how much carbon dioxide is produced in the country. You add up the total emissions from the factories, and you add up all the emissions from households, and you add up all the car emissions, and you add up all of the emissions from flatulent cows, etc., and you get a total of carbon dioxide emissions. That's called basically a production measure. But there is another way of measuring it, which really has far more justice, and that is a consumption measure, where you actually look at all of the goods and services consumed within a country, and you work out how much carbon dioxide was generated to produce those goods and services. A large part of the goods and services consumed here in Ireland, consumed in England, consumed in rich countries, was actually produced in poor countries, in China, in Bangladesh, in Mexico, wherever. So we should actually count, to get a consumption measure, we should count the amount of carbon dioxide generated in the production of all of the goods and services consumed within a country. We would then get a more accurate picture. The fact that so much carbon production has been outsourced through the outsourcing of production to low-wage countries creates a very distorted picture. And now the West is able to say, well, we're not the biggest carbon producer, China is. Forgetting that China is a big carbon producer precisely in order to satisfy the demand for goods in the rich countries. And so we can see here that if you actually look at that, if you draw a vertical line through 1980, which is sort of about a third of the way between 1950 and 2019, you can see then that the United States, which is the green, and the European Union 17, which is the blue, were responsible for the vast majority of the carbon dioxide production in 1980. Okay? And then we see just how much things have changed in the 40 years since then. And now we have India and China together accounting for more than half of the global carbon dioxide production. But as I say, that's been used by politicians in Britain and America and so on to try and basically wash their hands of responsibility and say China's the problem, China's the one that's burning all the carbon dioxide, forgetting that the reason why they're burning so much carbon dioxide is in part to satisfy the consumption goods that we're consuming here. So that's... And here is a picture that really shows when you actually look at trade flows and you try to, what they've done here is to calculate the carbon dioxide generated in the production of the goods and services. And I'll just draw your attention, you probably can't see it very clearly from here. In fact, I'm going to put my glasses on. But there's a big fat line there, which is the China's the carbon dioxide that is produced in the carbon dioxide that is generated in the production of goods made in China but consumed in North America. And it adds up to 395 gigatons of carbon dioxide. What you might not be able to see is just above that thick arrow, there is a very thin one, the thinnest on the screen. Those are the goods and services produced in the United States that are consumed in China. And so you see there that actually the 395 gigatons of carbon dioxide was generated to produce the goods and services that flowed from China to the United States, and just 26 gigatons, so about 6-7% in the to produce the goods and services produced in China and produced in the United States and consumed in China. And we see a similar picture there with, if you look at sort of somewhere near the middle, you can see this similar huge contrast between the thick arrow from China to Europe and the very thin, weedy little arrow that goes back. And you find that, you know, China is just representative here. They haven't filled in all of the pictures, they haven't shown the flows to Africa, etc., etc. But we've got the whole thing, you know, but there is, as I say, a third way to measure carbon dioxide. One article which I would recommend everybody to read is this article here by my friend and comrade Andy Higginbottom, who talks about, the title is Global Britain's Real Climate Changes. 2 out of the top 5 oil companies in the world are British, that's Shell and BP. Anyway, first of all, he points out here that he cites research which shows that when you look at a production-based measure and contrast it with a consumption-based measure, you see that the amount of carbon dioxide emissions that Britain is responsible for is more than twice what it would be, what it is if you just look at it as a production measure, which is the way that the British government and the way COP26 looks at things, just on the basis of production measure. If you change it for a consumption measure, you see a dramatically different picture. So the politicians have been patting themselves on the back saying we've got our carbon emissions under control. That evidence there gives the lie. But as I say, there is a third way, and that is to look at the carbon emissions that British companies are responsible for around the world. The most amazing thing is that BP on its own produces half as much again carbon dioxide as all of the farting cows and belching factories and households in the whole of the United Kingdom. Just one company produces more than half as much again as all emissions from all sources within the UK. And the Shell, the same thing. On its own, they produce half as much again as all carbon dioxide emissions generated within the UK. And then we have also, this is what the point he makes here, that the UK is also the headquarters for some of the most predatory and destructive extractivist companies that are just sucking all the wealth out of the land and chopping the rainforest down, massive open mines, just polluting and desecrating this planet as fast as they possibly can. And London is a huge headquarters for them. BHP Billiton and Anglo-American contribute about 3/4 and 2/3, as it says there. So those two top mining companies, they each of them produce 3/4 or 2/3, respectively, of the total carbon emissions by all farming, industry and domestic production in Britain. And so it's amazing how the Social Democrats and the Liberals and the Conservatives are all in total denial about this. And I could give you quotes from Ed Miliband and from leaders of the Labour Party. There's ignorance about this in our country. Ignorance. So, here we have an interesting little article. It talks about how Latin America's smog is the latest product from the Asian superpower exported to America. And as it says here, it says that pollution caused by China's manufacturing for export contributes between 12 and 24% of daily sulfate levels in Western United States. So the outsourcing of production from the United States to China, there's a bit of a blowback here. Some of that polluted air, it only takes apparently 2 or 3 days for trade winds to blow polluted air over from China, and it's already noticeable in the United States. But the net effects in the United States of the outsourcing have been to clean the air. The east of the United States is much more densely populated than the west. Much of their filthy industrial production has shut down and has been shipped to China. So although the air in the west of the United States is dirtier because of this, the air in the east, the air in the east of the United States, there it is, that's what it says here, is much cleaner thanks to this outsourcing of production. So what I wanted to do here is just to sort of bring actually bring into sharp focus what's going on, because it is incredible that, just look at these 15 of the biggest ships, which are container ships, just 15 ships produce more noxious gases than all of the cars on the road in every single country on earth. It is unbelievable. It is staggering. They've built their ships, they've designed the engines so they can burn bunker fuel, or what they call heavy fuel oil. The dregs left over after they've distilled the lighter distillates from crude oil, the sludge that's left at the end is what they've designed their ships to burn. And that's what's been going on. That's why just 15 ships produce as much noxious gases as all of the cars on the planet. It's just hard to fathom. There's been a lot of investigation into this, and some people dispute the exact thing, but the economists tend to avoid printing fake news. But exactly what anyway, so because of this, and this has been sort of known about, and one of the reasons why they do this is that as soon as you leave territorial waters, then there's pure anarchy. There's no law, no government, no international force able to stop. You can do what the hell you like once you get out of international waters, once you get into international waters. And so as soon as they leave territorial waters, they just burn whatever filthy fuel they can. And this has been a scandal, and it led finally in 2020 to the International Maritime Organization bringing in new rules under a treaty which 170 nations in the world have signed up to, which would reduce the sulfur content of the oil that's burned in the ships from 3.5% weight by weight sulfur down to 0.5%, so a cut of a seventh. Just to give you an example, the diesel DERV that you buy in a forecourt here is 0.001% sulfur. Okay. The sulfur that is being used, is being burnt by cruise ships, is 3.5%. So you can see if you divide 0.001 into 3.5, it basically means 3,500 times dirtier than diesel. So they were reducing it from 3.5% sulphur to 0.5%, which would still be 500 times more dirty than the diesel. So that was the rule that they brought in. What is just really shocking beyond words to me, I think, and hopefully to you, or I expect it will be to you, is this incredible story. These are the cruise ships. These are the container ships that are carrying all of this stuff from China, from Bangladesh, from Mexico, etc., etc. So they worked out that they could work out what's called cheap devices, so they could continue to burn this filthy fuel and comply with the new regulations. And they were given a cop-out. If they washed the fuel oil first, so that all of the dirt and the filth was washed straight into the ocean, then they could put relatively clean gas into the air, and they were given this permission. It's called a scrubber. So all of the exhaust gases that come out of the ship engine are actually washed in water, and they've spent billions rigging their vessels, and they're even scrapping old vessels because it's actually cheaper to build a new vessel with scrubbers built in than to actually fit a cruise ship. A container ship might cost as much as $8 million to fit with a scrubber, but they can just build a new ship which has got scrubbing facilities already built in that will allow them to continue burning the same filthy oil. It is just disgusting beyond words, and they know what this stuff is doing. It means instead of pumping the filth into the air and then allowing the rain to wash it through so it ends up in the ocean, eventually it just gets pumped straight into the ocean. That's capitalist efficiency for you. So, and this allows them to meet the standards demanded by the International Maritime Organization that kicked in on the 1st of January 2020. And if they don't have these scrubbers fitted, then they have to buy much more expensive fuel which fulfills the 0.5% limits. And the current cost of relatively less polluting 0.5% sulphur oil, which they're allowed to burn without scrubbing it, is more than twice the cost of the cheap oil, of the high sulphur content oil. And so they, because of this price discrepancy, they just do a cost-benefit calculation, and it works out that it's actually makes sense to go and burn the same filthy oil, but to pay money to fit a scrubber. So, not only that, but when they fit a scrubber, it actually reduces the efficiency of the ship engine, and they have to burn more fuel and emit even more carbon dioxide. So it's just... And as it says here, the change could have a devastating effect on wildlife in British waters and around the world. And it gives here, this is the figures from a few years back, that there are 3,756 there, but actually it's the reckon now it might be as many as 10,000 ships that are either fitted with scrubbers or are currently being set up. There are a total of 60,000 ships that are used. Apparently that's the size of the total merchant fleet that carries our goods and services around the world. And so this here, it's the largest, the bulk carriers, container ships and oil tankers. And for every ton of fuel burned, ships using open loop scrubbers emit approximately 45 tons of warm, acidic, contaminated wash water containing carcinogens, polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons that even in tiny quantities cause all kinds of deformations. They haven't even carried out any tests to see what the result of this is going to be. They just didn't bother. And also heavy metals, just wash straight into the ocean. Heavy metal pollution has been connected to damage to the central nervous system in humans and animals. and polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons have been blamed for skin, lung, bladder, liver and stomach cancers. And so and it's not just the container ships, it's the cruise ships. And cruise ships actually take their high-paying tourists on to the most pristine and beautiful parts of the world. And they go and send their sludge and filth into the most beautiful places on this planet. Not only that, but there are a number of countries, even in Europe, which don't have any real regulations about what cruise ships do when they're in port, and it's cheaper for the cruise ships to continue burning their filthy fuel, even when they're in port, than it is to connect up to the electricity, which they'd have to pay a lot more for. So they run their parties and run turn the lights on for the people in their cabins while they're in port, using this stuff and burning it. And this article explains all that. So here is just a few slides that talk about the cruise ships, because that side of it I find just, well, I haven't got words that I can just say here anyway. There are Carnival, that's the name of the cruise shipping company that have 50% of the global market for cruises, okay? Based in Florida. They are the worst offenders according to this survey. Their cruise ships are responsible for 10 times as much toxic sulfur dioxide as all of the cars in Europe. Just their 30 cruise ships. There's one of them. That's the sort of filth that is being poured out. This company is well known for just ignoring rules, ignoring laws. They pay a small fine. None of the executives, none of the people who break these rules, who pour their filth into the oceans, ever see a day inside prison. And here we have this beautiful, I love this. Don't you just notice this? You've heard this 1,000 times from all kinds of different companies. They issue this standard. Carnival remains committed to environmental excellence and protecting the environment in which we live, work and travel. Our aspiration is to leave the places we touch even better than when we first arrived. You've heard the same thing 1,000 times from all of these different capitalist companies. Whenever they're exposed for doing something nasty, then they come out with some shit like this, like the people who built the stuff, who made the cladding for Grenfell Tower. You can find quotes from them that say exactly the same thing. So, so then the question is, well, I was thinking these regulations came in 2020. I wanted to try and find out what the actual result was. Was there any noticeable reduction in the consumption of heavy fuel oil? The International Maritime Organization, when it adopted these new policies that came into force in 2020, didn't even discuss how to enforce them. They have no enforcement measures. They don't have any inspectors of their own. They just adopted these rules, and there's all of the enforcement of these rules is left to national governments to take responsibility for. Anyway, the result is that they find that demand for heavy fuel oil has actually remained stable. It hasn't dropped. The latest figures from September 2021 is that the new regulations that supposedly came into effect reduced the filth from 3.5% sulfur to 0.5% sulfur has not resulted in any noticeable reduction in demand for and consumption of heavy fuel oil. So I'm near at the end now. I wanted just to bring in another picture. We've got these, as you saw from the thickness of the arrows pointing to the trade flows from the poor countries to the rich countries, and the thinness of the arrows showing the trade flows back in the other direction. We have this. I mean, if you doubt whether we live in a world, if you doubt that capitalism is imperialist in its very core, in its very essence, just think about that. Ships laden with goods made by our brothers and sisters in sweatshops in Bangladesh and in China and in Mexico and so on. Travelling from the poor countries to the rich countries, and when they get to the rich countries, all of those containers are taken off and end up in the department stores, and you buy my shirt from Bangladesh, etc., etc. And then these ships go back empty, and then they get filled up and come out. What do we send back to the poor countries? Nothing. Actually, it's not true. We fill up some of the ships with plastic waste. They can get a bit of extra cash. They can get some money for sending their ship back, not completely empty, but filling it up with plastic rubbish, which then gets just dumped. And that's been a big scandal. And they're all pretending to be doing something about it, but you can be damn sure that it's going on, and it will continue to go on. So long as you can make money out of it, then it will continue to happen. They're filling their boats up with plastic rubbish and sending it back, and that way they're able to get a little bit of extra earning before they fill the same ship up with more stuff for Westerners to consume. And there's just two pictures there. And I will nearly finish my little story but it hasn't quite finished yet. We send something else back. I could ask whether anybody could possibly guess what else we send back, but maybe here we have it. There's a picture of one. We send back ballast water, because these ships would actually flop over if we didn't fill them up with water. You take all the containers out of them, they sort of rise up, and you have to go and fill them up with something heavy in order to stop them just flipping over. So what they do, they actually fill them up with water. And you can see here, once the first picture at top left is the discharging cargo. As the cargo is taken off, and the yellow bit is the cargo. When the cargo is taken off, you have to replace it with water in the ballast tanks which surround where the cargo is. Okay, and then you can send it back, because otherwise the ship will flop over, and obviously we don't want that to happen. But this seawater contains living creatures that are particular to one part of the world. So what we have is invasive species. Ship's ballast water is one of the main causes of the transfer of invasive species, aquatic species worldwide. The spread of invasive species is now regarded as one of the greatest threats to the ecological and the economic well-being of the planet, as this damage is often irreversible. And there it gives you some figures. One new invasion of an invasive species every 9 weeks. 7,000 aquatic species estimated are transferred in ballast water every hour of every day. Actually, that is a gigantic underestimate, because they're only looking at things that you couldn't see with the naked eye. There's all kinds of stuff going on. So, we are sending stuff back to them. And what's even more incredible is that actually there's very little study going on. Investigations are taking place are looking at invasive species that are brought with the ships from the poor countries to the rich countries, but most of these invasive species causing huge damage to the ecology, maritime ecology of the poor countries, is not very little is being done to assess the scale of this problem. We'll hear about it in the future. So here we have some of the invasive species there: zebra mussels and rattlewhelks, European green crabs anyway. So, my last two slides then is like, there has been a fantastic renaissance of Marxist ecology over the past 20 years, rediscovering how much Marx himself was an ecologist, how much he understood. Marx explained that use values, useful goods, are the product of human labour and the fruits of nature combined. That's use value. Exchange value is simply and only the product of human labour. Capitalists are only interested in exchange value. They're only interested in value which is determined by the quantity of labour that makes up the exchangeability of goods. You have what Marx explained in Capital is that capitalism is there is a fundamental contradiction between use value and exchange value. And in capitalism, capitalist society, exchange value predominates over use value. So it is actually wired into capitalism that they cannot take into account the costs, the natural costs of their production. I mean, in any case, how do you quantify costs? How do you work out what the economic cost of destroying the rainforest or destroying the purity of the ocean? Many of these costs are unquantifiable, and to even try to put them into monetary terms is itself obscene. How do you work? What is the value of a single human life? Let alone the 60,000 human beings that are reckoned to die every year because of the results of the pollution that we saw caused by the container ships. You can't put a number on this. It's an attempt to try and sort of quantify and turn into money terms these costs and to force the capitalists to take responsibility for them, but they never will. And if ever they were forced to, their system will become completely unsustainable, their profits would disappear, you'd have the biggest crash that the world has ever seen. Capitalism actually relies on the destruction. It is more and more and more a destructive economic system which has to be abolished, or else there is no future for humanity. So my last slide is from Marx's Capital. It's a great quote there, and all I would say is that every conversation we have about this and everything that I would like to put it into a framework, and that is to explain why we need a communist manifesto for the 21st century. The last communist manifesto that Marx and Engels published in 1948, that was 174 years ago. 174 years ago. We need a communist manifesto for the 21st century. Not to replace the one, but go back and read the 1848 Communist Manifesto if you haven't done so recently. It's a fantastic and incredibly fresh and up-to-date. You'll see many parallels and resonances, but we need a Communist Manifesto for the 21st century. And a big discussion, a big conversation that we can all take part in and people all over the world can take part in is what should go into a Communist Manifesto for the 21st century. And everything I say and everything I do is all guided by that question, trying to make a contribution to finding an answer to that question. Thank you.